The dust from that major upheaval in the lives of Hugo Tavares and his newfound family had in fact settled in the years that followed. The routine of flying between Rio de Janeiro and Lisbon became as natural as breathing for Rafael and Davi, who were now entering adolescence with the ease of someone who knew the world from two rich and complementary cultural perspectives. Hugo, that man who had once been the picture of cold ambition and executive solitude, continued to surprise those who had known him before. Fatherhood had not only transformed him, but had redefined him to his very core. He had learned the language of a teenage son's worried silences, the restrained joy of a small academic achievement, and above all, the immeasurable value of shared time. Marina, for her part, was flourishing in her career in Portugal, but her heart and thoughts were always connected to her children and to that unlikely and successful partnership she had built with Hugo. Life seemed to have found a remarkable balance, a hard-won harmony that now sounded like a soft, steady melody. However, as life is made up of seasons and not even the most serene calm lasts forever, small clouds began to form on the horizon of the Tavares family, almost imperceptible at first. Davi, the youngest, always the most outgoing and physically the most vulnerable due to his congenital heart condition, was entering a growth spurt typical of puberty. And with this growth, some of Marina and Hugo's old concerns, which had been dormant under layers of positive tests and a well-controlled medical routine, began to awaken. They were subtle things. A slightly more pronounced tiredness after playing soccer with friends, a paleness that took a little longer to disappear after an effort. Nothing alarming, the doctor said during routine checkups, just things related to age and development. But for parents who had already lived with constant fear, any small change was enough to trigger a silent alarm in their chest, an apprehension that they tried not to show so as not to worry the boy, but which they exchanged in glances and whispered conversations when they thought no one was listening. That subtle but persistent apprehension began to change Hugo and Marina's internal dynamics. Although they tried to maintain a facade of normality for the boys, especially for Davi, who was a smart and perceptive boy, communication between the two adults on the subject intensified. The nightly video calls, previously filled with everyday trivia and plans for the next vacation, now frequently diverted into detailed discussions about Davy's latest medical report, about the research Hugo had found on congenital heart disease in adolescence, or about the opinion of a new specialist Marina had consulted in Lisbon. They became detectives of their son's health, mentally noting every deep breath, every complaint of tiredness, every moment when he seemed less willing. Together, they decided to move forward, with some more specific tests, scheduling an appointment with a renowned pediatric cardiologist in Sao Paulo, taking advantage of one of Marina's visits to Brazil. It was a heavy burden, carrying that knowledge and that constant worry, trying to balance extreme care with the need to allow David to live his adolescence as normally and fully as possible, without turning him into a full-time patient in his own eyes. The turning point, the moment when the hidden concern began to take on clearer contours, happened during a seemingly ordinary Saturday afternoon in Rio. Davi, who had always been passionate about soccer and was one of the most skilled players on the school team, was playing a game with his friends in the condominium. Hugo watched from the balcony, as he always did, with a mixture of pride and his usual discreet vigilance. At one point, after a more intense race to reach the ball, Davi suddenly stopped, rested his hands on his knees, and his breathing became visibly labored. His face pale as paper, even under the afternoon sun. One of his friends asked if he was okay, and Davi, with a quick nod and a forced smile, said yes, that he was just tired, and tried to get back to the game, but his energy was not the same. Hugo felt a chill run down his spine. It was not the first time he had seen his son tired, but there was something different in that scene, a fragility he had not seen in years. Later, at home, Davy tried to downplay what had happened, saying it was just the heat. But Hugo saw a trace of fear in his son's eyes, the same fear that now settled firmly in his own heart and in Marina's, when he told her the episode in detail that night. The trip to Sao Paulo for the appointment with the pediatric cardiologist was fraught with tension that Hugo and Marina tried hard to hide, especially in front of Davy. They tried to maintain an air of normality, of just another routine checkup, but the weight of expectation was almost palpable between them. The doctor's office, modern and impeccable, seemed to Hugo a sanctuary of hope and at the same time a place of possible sentences. While Davy underwent a series of tests, some familiar, others new and more complex, Hugo and Marina waited in the waiting room, exchanging few words but communicating intensely through looks and small gestures of mutual support. Each minute seemed like an eternity. When they were finally called to speak with the specialist, with the results in hand, both of their hearts were beating wildly. The doctor, an experienced man with a calmness that contrasted with their anxiety, explained the situation clearly. Davy's congenital condition, although well managed over the years, was in fact being challenged by the rapid development of adolescence. His heart needed to work harder to keep up with his growing body, and some parameters indicated that even more rigorous monitoring and possibly a new therapeutic approach would be necessary to ensure his quality of life and avoid future complications. Leaving that office with a clearer, albeit worrying diagnosis was a mixture of relief and apprehension for Hugo and Marina. Relief at finally having a direction, at knowing what they were up against. Apprehension at the uncertainties of the future and the challenges that lay ahead. The most difficult conversation, however, was yet to come. Talking to Davy. He was no longer a small child who accepted everything passively. He was an intelligent teenager who sensed the gravity of the situation by the looks on his parents' faces and the seriousness of the tests. That night, in the hotel room, the three of them sat down, and Hugo, with Marina's help, explained to his son, with carefully chosen words, the reality of his condition and the need for new care. Davy listened to everything in silence, his gaze fixed on a random point in the room, absorbing every word. There were no immediate tears, no desperate questions, but a seriousness that impressed his parents. It was as if, at that moment, he was processing not just medical information, but the weight of responsibility over his own body, a maturity being forged in the urgency of the situation. Rafael, who had stayed in Rio, was informed by video call, and his silent concern for his younger brother was yet another layer of emotion on that dense day. The return home, whether to Rio with Hugo or later to Lisbon with Marina, was marked by a delicate adjustment to Davy's new routine. The medical recommendations were clear and required discipline that, for a teenager full of energy and eager to explore the world, sounded like a sentence of restrictions. The intense soccer games with his friends had to be replaced by more moderate activities. His diet became even more controlled, and new medications with strict schedules came into play. There were moments of explicit frustration on Davy's part. He felt different from his peers, felt restrained in his more youthful impulses, and, at times, a veiled sadness took over his gaze when he had to say no to an invitation to a riskier adventure, or when fatigue overcame him sooner than desired. Hugo and Marina went out of their way to offer support, to find leisure alternatives that were enjoyable and safe, and to validate their son's feelings, showing that they understood his anger, but that the measures were for his own good. It was a constant dance between overprotection, motivated by fear, and the encouragement of autonomy, essential for the self-esteem of a boy at that age. In this scenario of adaptations and challenges, Rafael emerged with even more evident strength and maturity. The older brother, always attentive and with an innate protective instinct, became a fundamental pillar for Davy. He not only understood his brother's limitations, but actively sought ways to include him, to adapt games and programs so that Davy would not feel excluded or diminished. If friends invited him to a more intense basketball game, Raphael was the first to suggest a lighter alternative or to convince the group to take it easy when Davy was present. He also became a silent confidant for his brother, someone with whom Davy could vent his frustrations without feeling judged or overly pampered. Hugo observed this dynamic between his sons with a heavy heart. He felt immense pride in Raphael's sensitivity and loyalty, while at the same time a pang of sadness struck him when he saw the burden that, in a certain way, both boys carried, each in their own way, due to the condition that life had imposed on them. It was further proof of the resilience of that family, forged in the bonds of love and complicity. The months that followed were filled with relentless medical monitoring. Consultations, tests, medication adjustments, and constant monitoring of Davy's well-being became the norm. Despite all the efforts and the boys' discipline in following the recommendations, the medical team began to signal, with increasing caution, that the responses to conservative treatment might not be enough to guarantee the stability of his condition in the long term, especially considering that he still had growth phases ahead of him. Puberty, with its intense changes, continued to be a stress factor for Davy's heart. It was during a re-evaluation consultation after a new series of more in-depth tests that the head cardiologist, with the delicacy that the situation required, introduced the possibility of a more significant medical intervention. It was not an emergency, he stressed, but a consideration for the near future, a corrective surgical procedure which, although involving risks, like any heart surgery, could offer Davy a substantial improvement in his quality of life and greater security to face adult life without so many limitations. The news, even though presented as a possibility to be considered, fell like a heavy shadow over Hugo and Marina. The mere sight of the word surgery associated with Davy's name was enough to reopen all the floodgates of fear and anguish that Hugo and Marina thought they had under control. Suddenly, all of life's other concerns, work, finances, the logistics of living between two continents, became insignificant in the face of the magnitude of that prospect. The idea of subjecting their son to such an invasive procedure was terrifying. The nights were once again long, filled with dark thoughts and the incessant search for information, for second and third medical opinions. Davy, when told about this new possibility, demonstrated a maturity that continued to surprise. He asked direct questions, wanted to understand the risks and benefits, and although the fear was visible in his adolescent eyes, there was also a determination to face whatever was necessary. Raphael, ever the loyal brother, immersed himself in research with his parents, trying to find success stories, reports of other young people who had undergone similar procedures. The Tavares family, once again, found themselves united in the face of adversity that would test all their emotional limits and their ability to make decisions under immense pressure. The period following the suggestion of surgery was one of the most excruciating for Hugo and Marina. They dove headfirst into everything related to Davy's condition and the proposed procedure. They consulted specialists not only in Brazil and Portugal, but also through online conferences with doctors in the United States and Europe, seeking consensus, a light that would guide them to the best decision. Each new opinion brought with it an avalanche of technical information, success statistics, lists of possible complications, and, invariably, the difficult realization that there was no easy or risk-free answer. Hugo, with his analytical businessman's mind, created comparative spreadsheets, while Marina, more intuitive, focused on the emotional aspects and the quality of human care offered by each medical team. Davy actively participated in some of these conversations, especially with the doctors who were more open to dialoguing with a teenage patient. He read, researched on his own on the internet, which sometimes caused more anxiety in the parents, and expressed his fears and hopes with surprising clarity. The final decision, Hugo and Marina knew, needed to be a family consensus, with Davy's well-being and wishes weighing significantly in the balance. After weeks of anguish, research, and countless conversations that lasted until late at night, the decision was made. They would opt for surgery. The long-term benefits, the promise of a life with fewer restrictions and more security for Davy, spoke louder than their immediate fears. They chose a medical team in Boston, in the United States, internationally recognized for their expertise in the specific type of procedure that Davy needed. From that point on, a new phase began: preparations. It was necessary to organize visas, flights, accommodation for what could be a long period. In addition to all the logistics of reconciling Hugo and Marina's professional lives with the need to be by their son's side, they decided that both would accompany Davy, while Rafael, who would be 17 years old and more independent, would stay in Rio under the care of an Aunt Marina trusted, but with Hugo maintaining daily and intense contact. Davy's heart, and that of the entire family, was filled with a mixture of apprehension and hope. The countdown to the day of the surgery had begun, and each moment together seemed even more precious and full of meaning. The trip to Boston was different from any other they had ever taken. There was none of the excitement of a vacation or the curiosity of tourist discoveries. Every kilometer traveled seemed to increase the burden of anxiety and expectation that Hugo, Marina, and Davy carried. They settled into a small rented apartment near the hospital, a space that quickly became a refuge for silent prayers and whispered conversations full of hope and fear. The days leading up to the surgery were a succession of preoperative appointments, final exams, and long conversations with the medical team, who, with professionalism and empathy, sought to reassure the family, explaining every detail of the procedure. Hugo and Marina took turns not leaving Davy alone, trying to create moments of lightness, watching movies, making small talk. But tension was a constant presence in the air. Davy, in turn, oscillated between admirable courage, making jokes and trying to reassure his parents, and moments of introspection where fear was etched in his adolescent gaze, now more serious than ever. It was in these moments that Hugo's tight hug or Marina's caressing affection became the most vital safe haven. Finally, the morning of the surgery arrived, cold and gray, as if the weather in Boston mirrored the family's state of mind. The drive to the hospital was made in almost complete silence, broken only by the nurses' routine instructions when they arrived on the inpatient floor. Dressing Davy in those impersonal and sterile hospital gowns was one of the most difficult moments for Hugo, a palpable reminder of her son's vulnerability. Marina, with tears in her eyes but a firm voice, kept telling him how much she loved him and how strong he was. As they accompanied Davy on the stretcher to the entrance of the surgical center, the words seemed to disappear. All that remained were their looks, filled with an intensity that transcended any verbal expression. One last "I love you, my son" from Hugo, a kiss on the forehead from Marina, and the doors closed, taking Davy into the hands of the surgeons and leaving behind two parents immersed in an ocean of anguish. The waiting room in the minutes and hours that followed became a limbo of agony, where each tick of the clock echoed like a hammer blow in the chest. The hours in the hospital waiting room in Boston dragged by with cruel slowness, each minute weighing a ton on Hugo and Marina's shoulders. The undrinkable coffee from the vending machine, the cold hallways, and the distant buzz of other lives also facing their own hospital dramas made up the backdrop to that agony. For Hugo, it was a powerlessness he hadn't felt since the day he discovered his children's existence. He, the man accustomed to controlling situations and dictating results, was now a mere spectator of fate, depending entirely on the skill of others and The strength of that small body struggling in the operating room. Marina, more shaken on the outside, clung to a rosary and to the sweet memories of Davi's childhood, alternating between silent prayers and suppressed tears. They called Raphael every hour, and the boy, even far away in Rio, tried to convey strength to his parents, although his own voice was choked with concern for his brother. Every time a door opened or a doctor hurried past, Hugo and Marina's hearts leapt in the hope and dread that it was some news. After what seemed like a lifetime, but which the clock showed was just over 6 hours, one of the surgeons on the team, still with his cap and mask partially lowered, walked towards them. Hugo and Marina stood up with a start, their bodies rigid with tension, their eyes fixed on the doctor, searching for any sign, any clue in his expression even before he opened his mouth. The surgeon, a middle-aged man with a tired but serene air, looked at them both and gave a slight smile, almost imperceptible, but which to those desperate parents was like the first ray of sunshine after an endless storm. "The surgery went well," he began, and the relief that flooded Hugo and Marina was so overwhelming that Marina's legs weakened, and Hugo had to support her, feeling his own tears finally break through the barrier of containment. The doctor went on to explain that the procedure had been complex, but that they had managed to perform all the planned corrections, and that David was stable and was being transferred to the pediatric intensive care unit, where he would remain under close observation. It was not the end of the journey, they knew, but the first and most feared battle seemed to have been won. The wait to finally see Davy in the pediatric ICU seemed almost as long as the surgery itself. When the nurse in charge finally led them to the bed, Hugo and Marina felt a lump in their throats. Seeing their son there, so pale and fragile amidst so many tubes, monitors, and the constant beeping of the machines, was a shock, despite all their mental preparation. It was their boy, their Davy, always so talkative and full of life. Now in a deep sleep induced by anesthesia, his chest covered in bandages. But he was there, alive, and his heart, now repaired, beat at a rhythm that, although closely monitored, brought a breath of indescribable hope. Marina approached slowly, stroked her son's hair with infinite delicacy, and whispered words of love and encouragement, while Hugo, at her side, held Davy's small hand, feeling the warmth of life and struggling to contain the emotion that threatened to overflow. The nurses, with a mixture of professionalism and affection, explained every detail of the care, and their calm presence was a comfort in that tense and delicate atmosphere. The days that followed in the ICU were a roller coaster of small victories and contained anxieties. Hugo and Marina established a rotation so that Davy would never be alone, taking turns at his bedside, barely sleeping, barely eating, nourished only by hope and the strong hospital coffee. Each small sign of progress was celebrated like a goal in a championship final. The first conscious blink of an eye, a slight squeeze of his father's hand, the gradual reduction of sedation. Extubation, when Davy was finally able to breathe without the help of the machines, was a moment of indescribable relief. And then, the first word, a whispered "Mom" in a weak voice, but which to Marina sounded like the most beautiful symphony. Hugo, upon hearing his son call him Dad, with a hint of a smile on his pale lips, felt his chest fill with a gratitude so deep that he could barely express it. The news was passed on to Raphael in Rio, who was thrilled with each advance and suffered along with each small incident, anxious to be able to see his brother, even if it was via video call. Little by little, very little by little, Davy began his journey back. After a week that seemed like an eternity in the intensive care unit, Davy was finally discharged to a normal room in the hospital. This transfer was a milestone celebrated silently by Hugo and Marina, a clear sign that the worst of the immediate crisis was over and that the recovery, although still long and full of care, was following a positive course. In the room, with a little more privacy and a less oppressive environment than the ICU, Davi began to interact more, to ask questions about what had happened, to express his wishes and also his pains and discomforts. Respiratory and motor physiotherapy began gradually, and each small movement, each exercise completed, was a battle won. There were days when he was more energetic, when Davy's characteristic good humor came to the fore, joking with the nurses or planning what he would do when he returned home. But there were also more difficult days, when the pain was more intense, fatigue quickly overcame him, and the frustration of not being able to do the simple things he used to do made him irritable or introspective. Hugo and Marina took turns providing care, learning to be nurses, psychologists, and, above all, present and patient parents, encouraging each step, no matter how small. As soon as Davy settled into his room and the doctors gave him a more stable prognosis, Hugo and Marina agreed that it was time for Raphael to come to Boston. The brothers missed each other immensely, and Raphael's presence, their parents knew, would be a balm not only for Davy but for all of them. The arrival of his older brother was an emotional event. Raphael entered the hospital room with a mixture of caution and anxiety, and when he saw Davy, still pale and thinner, but with a smile on his lips when he saw him, he could not contain his emotion. The hug between the two was long and filled with deep meaning, a silent demonstration of the unbreakable bond that united them. Raphael's presence brought a breath of fresh air to the hospital environment. He told them news about Rio, about his friends, about school, distracting Davy from the pain and boredom of his hospitalization. He also brought a bit of normality to life outside, a promise that Davy would soon be back to his routine. For Hugo and Marina, seeing their two children together again, supporting each other, was a relief and a renewed source of strength to face the next stages of recovery. With Raphael around, Davy's days in the hospital took on a new color, a lightness that neither Hugo nor Marina, no matter how hard they tried, could replicate with the same naturalness. There was a complicity between the brothers, a language of their own made up of inside jokes, affectionate teasing, and a mutual understanding that dispensed with words. Raphael helped Davy with the little things that recovery still made difficult, reaching for an object, adjusting the pillows, or simply passing the time with a game of video games adapted to his brother's conditions. He had the gift of making Davy laugh even in the most uncomfortable moments, and his constant presence was a reminder that normal life, full of plans and teenage dreams, awaited him outside those hospital walls. Hugo and Marina observed, moved, the strength of that brotherly bond. Raphael's arrival allowed them to breathe a little too, to indulge in a short walk around the city or a more peaceful dinner, knowing that Davy was in excellent company, supported by his brother's unconditional love. Finally, after weeks of hospitalization that seemed like months, and with Davy showing progressive and encouraging improvement, the doctors announced his long-awaited discharge from the hospital. It was not yet his release to return home, to Brazil or Portugal, but rather to his rented apartment in Boston, where he would continue his outpatient treatment and intensive rehabilitation. Leaving the hospital was a moment of immense joy and also of some apprehension. They were leaving behind the security of constant medical supervision to take full responsibility for Davy's care in a domestic environment, albeit temporarily and in a foreign city. The routine in the apartment was reorganized according to his needs. Strict schedules for medication, home physiotherapy sessions, a carefully balanced diet, and above all, a lot of patience and encouragement. Davy, each day, regained a little more of his independence, walking more firmly, feeling less pain, and the gleam of hope in his eyes became more intense. The Tavares family, united and resilient, faced this new stage with the determination of those who had already overcome many obstacles and knew that the worst was definitely behind them. Life in the rented apartment in Boston soon found its own rhythm. a cadence marked by Davy's physical therapy sessions, medication schedules, and regular hospital visits for monitoring. Little by little, Davy was reclaiming the territory of his own body. He started with short walks inside the apartment, then through the building's hallways, and finally, short walks in the nearby park, always accompanied by Hugo, Marina, or Raphael. Each extra step, each exercise completed with less difficulty, was a victory celebrated by everyone. During breaks, they tried to create an atmosphere of normality. Raphael, who had revealed himself to be a surprisingly skilled cook for his age, took charge of some meals, bringing a bit of home-cooked flavor to their routine. They watched movies together, played board games, and on cooler evenings, Hugo told stories, not the ones he had made up in the past, but stories about his own life, his mistakes, and his lessons learned, creating a new bond of complicity with his teenage children. They missed home, their friends, and their routine in Brazil and Portugal greatly, but their unity and focus on Davy's recovery made those days in a foreign land a testament to the strength of that family. The weeks went by, and with them, Davy's strength and disposition visibly increased. The medical reports were increasingly encouraging, and the team that was accompanying him in Boston began to talk, at first timidly and then more confidently, about the possibility of his release so that he could continue the final phase of his recovery at home, closer to his environment and his complete support network. The news was received with an explosion of contained joy, as there were still protocols to follow and a series of recommendations for the trip and subsequent care. Hugo and Marina then began preparations for the return, which would first be to Rio de Janeiro, where Davy would be monitored by his local medical team, now working in conjunction with the specialists in Boston. Saying goodbye to the doctors and nurses who had helped them so much was a moment of great emotion and gratitude. Those professionals had not only been competent, they had been humane, welcoming, and had become part of the family's story of overcoming adversity. Leaving Boston meant leaving behind a difficult chapter, but also a period of immense learning and strengthening of the bonds that united them. Arriving in Rio de Janeiro was a whirlwind of emotions. Seeing the city again, the familiar smell of the sea, the tropical heat, all of this brought indescribable comfort to Hugo, Marina, and the boys, especially Davy. Even though he was still recovering with the need for continuous care and a slower pace, being at home, in his room, surrounded by his things, had an immediate therapeutic effect on him. His maternal grandparents and some of the family's closest friends prepared a warm but discreet welcome, aware of the fragility of the moment. Marina decided to stay in Rio for a few more weeks, postponing her return to Lisbon to help Davy fully recover, and so that they could, together, define the new routine of care with the Brazilian medical team. For Hugo, having the family together under the same roof again, even if temporarily and in circumstances that still required attention, was a blessing. He resumed his care for Davy with full dedication, now at home, an environment that, although more welcoming, also brought new logistical challenges for physiotherapy and monitoring. Little by little, with the caution that the moment demanded, Davy began to recapture fragments of his old life. The first visits from his closest friends, initially brief and full of curiosity and affection, were a balm for his adolescent soul, reconnecting him to the world he had missed so much. With the help of private tutors, he began to catch up on his studies, discovering a new focus and perhaps a new appreciation for learning, now that life had shown him how precious each day was. There were still physical limitations, of course. Playing soccer with the same intensity as before was out of the question, at least for a good while. But he began to take an interest in other activities, such as chess and drawing, encouraged by Raphael and his parents. There was a newfound maturity in him, a depth in the gaze of someone who had faced his own finitude and come out the other side stronger, more aware. Hugo and Raphael were his biggest supporters, celebrating every small achievement, from a good night's sleep without pain to the completion of a complex school project. The Tavares family learned once again to reinvent themselves and find beauty in the journey, no matter how arduous it was. The weeks with Marina in Rio flew by, between taking care of Davi, talking to the doctors, and reorganizing the family routine. With her youngest son visibly stronger, more independent, and with a well-established follow-up plan with the Brazilian medical team, the time came for Marina to return to Lisbon, to her professional commitments and her life there. This time, the farewell was different from the previous ones, especially that tense departure for Boston. There was, of course, the anticipated longing, the heavy heart of being separated from her children. Again, but also a greater serenity, the confidence that Davi was in excellent hands with Hugo and Raphael, and that the worst was truly behind her. She kissed her children for a long time, exchanged a look of mutual gratitude and complicity with Hugo, and left with the promise of daily video calls and a reunion soon, perhaps for the end-of-year holidays, already planning the boys' return to Portugal. Hugo, now alone with the two boys, felt the weight of responsibility, but also immense joy at having Davi at home, recovering well, and at having the invaluable partnership of Raphael, who had become a true right-hand man. As the months passed, Davi's recovery continued to amaze everyone. The teenager who had undergone complex heart surgery was re-emerging with a vitality and maturity that went beyond his young age. His physical limitations were gradually diminishing, and although high-performance soccer was still a distant dream, he discovered new passions: photography, which allowed him to observe the world with a more attentive and poetic eye; music, learning to play the guitar with impressive dedication. But the greatest transformation had occurred within him. Davi had developed a rare empathy, a deep appreciation for the little things in life, and a genuine desire to make a difference. He began to be interested in stories of overcoming obstacles, to research the work of doctors and nurses, and even to talk, albeit timidly, about one day perhaps pursuing a career in the health field, so that he could help others as he had been helped. His experience, instead of making him bitter, seemed to have opened a new window into his soul, revealing a more aware, more grateful young man with an incredibly positive outlook on the challenges that life could still present him. While Davi was on his path of rediscovery and strengthening himself, Raphael, his older brother who was always there, was also navigating the intense waters of his late adolescence. The experience of Davi's surgery, the family's unity, and the overcoming of his fears had all left deep and positive marks on his character. He had become an even more responsible and thoughtful young man with an admirable sense of loyalty. The time had come to think seriously about his academic and professional future. Raphael had always shown a special talent for logic and technology, and his dream was to study software engineering at a top university. Hugo and Marina, proud of their son's determination, offered all the support he needed, from researching the best institutions to encouraging him to study hard for the entrance exam. Seeing him so focused and at the same time so aware of his role in the family, as a brother and as a son, filled Hugo's heart with calm admiration. It was proof that even in the midst of storms, it was possible to cultivate dreams and build promising futures. Hugo, in turn, watched his two sons grow up with a mixture of nostalgia and deep gratitude. He looked at Raphael, about to take flight into adulthood, and saw not only an intelligent and promising young man, but a human being of exemplary integrity and strength of character. He looked at Davi, rebuilding his life with contagious resilience and joy, and saw a daily miracle, a constant lesson about the value of life and the ability to overcome. Being the father of those two boys was, for Hugo, the greatest and most significant of all his undertakings. He learned the art of attentive listening, of thoughtful advice, of welcoming silence, and of encouraging encouragement. He discovered that parenting teenagers was a constant learning experience, full of nuances and challenges different from those of childhood, but equally rewarding. That bond, which had begun with shock and overwhelming guilt, had become a solid connection, woven with threads of complicity, mutual respect, and a love that only grew stronger with time and with the trials they overcame together. Time, that master of healing wounds, and settling dust, continued its course, and with it the Tavares family's life began to take on a new and well-deserved tranquility. Davi, a year and a half after the surgery and rigorous medical monitoring, received the news that everyone had been anxiously awaiting. His heart was strong, responding incredibly well to the procedure, and he could lead a practically normal life, with the necessary precautions, of course, but free from those more severe limitations that had caused him so much anguish. The doctors used terms like exemplary recovery, and for Hugo, Marina, and Raphael, those words sounded like the sweetest melody. Almost simultaneously with this excellent news, Raphael received the acceptance letter from the engineering university he had longed for, one of the most prestigious in the country. These were two immense victories, two reasons for pride and gratitude that flooded the family's hearts, proving that, after the most intense storms, the sun always shines again with renewed strength. It was as if life had given them a hug, recognizing all the struggle and resilience they had demonstrated. The celebration of these achievements was intimate, but deeply meaningful. They decided to take a trip together, the four of them, to a place of lush nature that Davi had always dreamed of visiting, something that had previously seemed unthinkable due to his condition. Marina came from Lisbon especially for the occasion, and those days amidst stunning landscapes, light, walks and lots of conversations around an improvised campfire were a balm for everyone's soul. There were no expensive gifts or ostentation, just the genuine joy of each other's company, the complicity in their eyes, and the certainty that they had overcome together one of the greatest challenges of their lives. During a special dinner on a starry night, they raised toasts not only to Davi and Raphael's victories, but to the strength of their family, the love that united them, and the second, a chance that life, in a tortuous but generous way, had given Hugo to be the father he never knew he could be. They were tears of happiness, of relief, and above all, of immense gratitude for simply being there together and strengthened. After the celebratory trip, the Tavares family's life entered a new phase, marked by serenity and the fulfillment of their children's dreams. Raphael, with the enthusiastic support of his parents, moved to another city to attend the engineering college he had always dreamed of. The farewells were emotional, but filled with pride and the certainty that he was ready for this new journey. Davi, on the other hand, flourished. With his health restored and a new passion for photography and music, he became an even more vibrant and engaged teenager, actively participating in cultural projects at school and even forming a small band with friends. Hugo and Marina's routine as parents continued to be fluid and supportive, now adapted to the reality of a son in college and another teenager exploring his talents. Video calls were constant, and the meetings, when possible, were always filled with affection and that unique complicity that only time and shared experiences can build. It was a precious normality, achieved with great struggle, and each day was valued as a gift. Hugo, in particular, found in this new phase a peace of mind that he had never imagined possible in his days as an executive obsessed with material success. The man who once measured life in numbers and corporate achievements now found true value in the little things. In a phone call from Raphael telling him about a challenging project at college, in a new melody that Davi was composing on the guitar, in a quiet dinner where Marina, during one of her visits to Rio or he to Lisbon, shared his latest readings. He learned that being a father went far beyond providing. It was being present, listening, supporting your children's dreams, even if those dreams took them far away. The lessons learned during Davy's illness, the family's unity in the face of adversity, all of this had deepened his transformation even further. He became a more attentive listener, a wiser counselor, and above all, a man who radiated a contagious serenity, the fruit of the certainty that he had found his true purpose in the bonds of love that united him to his family. The relationship between Hugo and Marina, which had risen from the ashes of a painful past and had been consolidated during the ordeal of Davy's illness, had become a solid and genuine friendship, an example of partnership and mutual respect. The old resentment that had once separated them had given way to a rare complicity, built on the unshakable foundation of love for their children and mutual admiration for the way each had reinvented themselves. They were each other's confidants and advisors on matters that went far beyond raising Raphael and Davy. They shared professional joys, personal anxieties, and the simple satisfaction of seeing their children grow into good men. For those who saw them interacting with the naturalness and affection of old friends, it was difficult to imagine the turbulence that had once marked the beginning of that story. They proved that it was possible to rewrite narratives, transform pain into learning, and build bridges where before there had only been chasms. They were, without a doubt, the two pillars that supported their children's trajectory of success and balance. Years continued to pass, and with them Raphael and Davy began to soar, ever higher and more confident. Raphael, after graduating from engineering college with distinction, soon got involved in innovative projects, emerging as a talented and ethical professional, carrying with him the responsibility and worldview that life and family had taught him. Davy, with his artistic sensitivity and experience of overcoming obstacles, found his way into documentary photography and music, using his art to tell stories, to inspire and to touch people's souls. His health, although always monitored, remained stable, allowing him to live with fullness and passion. Seeing them like this, adults following their paths with integrity and happiness, was for Hugo and Marina the greatest of all rewards, the certainty that despite all the setbacks, they had fulfilled their mission as parents. The legacy of love, resilience, and unity that they built together was the most valuable inheritance they could leave. And so the life of that family, which had once been marked by secrets, disagreements, and deep fears, found a serene bed to follow its course. There were no more major twists and turns or dramas that kept them awake at night. In their place, a peace was established, built day after day on the solidity of bonds of affection, on respect for individuality, and on the joy of simple, everyday achievements. Visits from Raphael, now an engineer with a full schedule, were always a reason to celebrate. Davy's artistic work, gaining recognition, filled the parents with immense pride. The conversations between Hugo and Marina, crossing the ocean via video calls or during face-to-face meetings, were proof that love, in its most varied forms, can be a foundation for a lifetime. It was the beauty of normality, of continuity, of a happiness that needed no fanfare, because it resided in the essence of the relationships they cultivated with such care and dedication over the years. For Hugo Tavares, the man who once held the title of billionaire CEO as his greatest trophy, the true measure of his wealth was revealed in something that no amount of money could buy. It was in the sparkle in his children's eyes when they shared his victories, in the trust with which they sought his advice, in the tight hug he received for no apparent reason. It was in the loyal and complicit friendship he built with Marina, the woman he had once hurt so much, but whom life, in its peculiar wisdom, had put back on his path to teach him about forgiveness and partnership. He, who had once felt on top of the world but deeply lonely, had discovered that the pinnacle of existence was not in glass and steel skyscrapers, but in the simplicity of a home warmed by love, in the certainty of belonging and being loved unconditionally. His transformation had been complete, silent in its final stages, but deeply rooted in every gesture, in every word, in every look that now reflected the peace of someone who had finally found himself. And so, like a river meeting the sea, the story of the Tavares family, with its twists and turns, its currents and backwaters, continued to flow. There was no longer any talk of great dramas or breathtaking twists and turns. The news that arrived sporadically was always of a comforting normality. A new project by Raphael, an exhibition by Davi, a trip by Hugo to visit his children, or by Marina to see her family in Brazil. The seasons of life followed their cycle, bringing with them grey hair for Hugo and Marina, full maturity for Raphael and Davi, and the certainty that the bonds that united them were stronger than time and distance. For those who followed closely, or even for those who only heard the echoes of this journey, the image of a tapestry woven with the threads of pain, hope, forgiveness, and above all, a resilient love capable of transforming the most arid of deserts into the most fertile of gardens, remained. There was no grand finale, no fanfare-filled conclusion. Their lives simply followed their course, like so many other lives that, in their apparent simplicity, carry universes of complexity and beauty. Lessons were learned, hearts were healed and transformed, and what remained was the essence of what really matters: human connections, the ability to love and give of oneself, and the beauty of finding a purpose beyond oneself. And so, like someone watching a boat disappear over the horizon, leaving only the memory of its passage and the serenity of the waters, the story of this family fades into the vastness of time, a silent testimony that, even in the most unexpected plots of fate, it is always possible to find a way back to the heart.